So now I want to introduce Emily Castor-Warren, who is the moderator of the next panel. And she recently did moderate another panel for us about a month ago, and she did such a stellar job. We just had to invite her back to do another one. And this panel is about the state of transit and shared mobility, and really looking now, but also into the future. So Emily is a principal and director of policy at Nelson Nygaard. I first met Emily, and many of you probably did as well, when she was the policy person at Lyft. She joined Lyft very early in the very beginning, when there was only a handful of employees, and she kind of took off around the country working on policy issues for Lyft and engaging with cities across the country. And she really helped build that company. Emily was then also at the World Economic Forum, and she headed up policy at Lime before moving to her current job. Emily is a thinker and a doer, and a lot of analytic chops there. So, and she is a very new member of the Shared Use Mobility Center Board of Directors as well. So welcome, Emily, and she will introduce the rest of the panel.
Wonderful, thanks Sharon. Appreciate the introduction, and excited to jump into this conversation. What better way to kick it off than to hear first from Mary Nichols about the broader purpose that we're really trying to serve here in dramatically changing travel behavior so that we can affect climate change, along with a lot of other important objectives in communities around the country. So many of us have worked to try to make it possible and easy to live without a car by using mobility services, public mobility services like public transit, and also increasingly shared mobility services provided by the private sector like Lyft, like micromobility. And yet in this moment, we find ourselves at a time when the financial health of all mobility services at this moment, when travel demand has absolutely fallen off a cliff, is really threatened. And when a few months ago we might have been talking about, well, how can we kind of shape the usage of these so we make sure they have a positive impact, and how can we try to grow transit and really take it to the next level. Now we're in almost a defensive posture where we are worried about actually shoring them up and making sure they can continue to operate and provide the value that we hope that we'll be able to carry forward into that bigger vision in the future. So for this panel, we are trying to look beyond the crisis of the immediate moment, as all these organizations are trying to kind of keep the lights on, and we're looking to the longer term and asking ourselves, what will the long-term effects be of all of the things that are happening right now? What might some of the changes be that stay with us long after this crisis as a result of what's occurring, both for the good or possibly, concerns, things that may shape our efforts that are new challenges, and what can we do to prepare ourselves to deal with the fallout of those and steer them in the right direction? So to lead that conversation, we have some fantastic experts that I'd like to just briefly list by name. First of all, we have Chris Pangilinan, who's the head of global policy for public transportation at Uber, and many of you may have known him in his prior roles in the public and nonprofit sectors. I met him back when he worked at the SFMTA. He subsequently was at Transit Center and has a lot of knowledge about the public transportation space, and is now experiencing how that intersects with the private side at transportation network companies. We also have David Block-Schachter, who is the Chief Business Officer at Transit, a multimodal app that many of you may know. It's a great seamless way to identify different transportation options and book and pay for them. And before that, he also worked in the public sector at the MBTA. And before that, I remember I met him when he was working at Bridge, a private microtransit company operating in the Boston area. So he's also experienced both sides of that public and private experience. We also have Kim Lucas, who is recently in a new role as Assistant Director of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure in the city of Pittsburgh, working with a former Nelson Nygaard alum, Karina Ricks, who's the director of that department and doing some really creative things. And she previously was at the District Department of Transportation in DC, working on a lot of bicycle, pedestrian, and sustainability programs. It has a broad view of how cities are intervening in this time. On the public transit side of things, we have Chris Van Eyken, who's a senior associate at Transit Center, has looked at best practices in transit agencies all over the world and is in the midst of the work that they're doing right now to assess how transit agencies will be affected and can respond to the things in this moment. Finally, we have Dillon Twombly, who's the Chief Revenue Officer at VIA. And VIA, of course, is a private microtransit provider that does work directly with public transit agencies all over the country to provide microtransit solutions. So with that, I'd love to dive into an opening question. And we've talked about a lot of these short-term financial strains that transit agencies and shared mobility companies are experiencing right now. As we shift to a long-term view, I want to kind of warm up this discussion by having a quick lightning round where each of our panelists will just give us a quick gut reaction about 2 effects that you think will shape transit and shared mobility moving forward because of this crisis. And because we don't want it to be all gloom and doom, let's make it 1 positive and 1 kind of negative or troubling thing that you think are going to stay with us for the long term out of this crisis. And I'm going to go ahead and put David on the spot first. David, what do you think are the long-term effects that we're going to feel from this off the top of your head?
Myself. I was going to say, let me start by unmuting myself. I would just say that anyone who says that they know what comes next is wrong. So take anything that I say with a complete and total grain of salt. But I would say the biggest effect that we're going to see really is an increase in working from home. Even public agencies you see with these like formerly draconian policies on working from home have now been able to go fully distributed right away. And that was a decade out 3 months ago. And you're going to see it, differently at every hour of every day. So some people will be 2 days a week, some will just be coming in for meetings, not equally distributed. So there's also going to be some major equity impacts, but it also means that there's going to be less peaky peaks in transit systems and on the roads and changes to demand patterns spatially. I think the negative implications of this are like super stressed budgets, probably permanent cutbacks in service, more people who can actually buying their way out of traveling in these big shared metal boxes. But on the positive side, the peak is where there's a ton of costs for any transportation service. And so if we've got flattened peaks and employer policies that encourage this, and there's an ability to rethink services in a way that's flexible, like we heard Jeff Tumlin talking about really eloquently yesterday, allowing people to think about the roots of who and what their service is for. So I think that there's a real positive possibility as we begin to see the other kind of peak spreading.
That's great. Let's go to you, Kim. What's top of mind?
Yeah, so obviously starting with the negative is it could be a future where people don't want to ride transit for a while, and that could result in a reduction in transit services because of the loss of revenue and projections that the revenue might not come back. But I think from the positive side, it's an opportunity for innovation. It's been a while since I worked in transit directly, over a decade probably at this point. But from what I remember, oftentimes innovation has to take a back seat to just keeping your head above water and just getting your vehicles out on routes on a day-to-day basis and just keeping afloat because of constrained resources. So now that there's a little bit of a gap and maybe some opportunity to think strategically and I know in Pittsburgh, there have been some conversations about microtransit and how do you focus on essential services. I think there could be an opportunity to be a little more strategic and a little innovative. And when you have less resources, you might have to think a little more about how you use them and not follow the path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm. Chris, V, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'll start with my negative. I would echo the concerns about financial constraints for agencies. This is going to be a tough few years for agencies. I would say that beyond that, psychologically, it's tough. Here in New York, for example, the MTA has lost over 80 operators. They've lost their lives trying to provide service to essential workers. So I think as we recover, we should try to keep them in our minds and remember them and the sacrifice they've made over this time. I think positive would be there's been a shift in attitude about street space in cities across the US and the world, where a lot of agencies and DOTs are considering repurposing general traffic lanes for recreation or bike and pedestrians to get about. I think as cities reopen and we get back to business, commuters need to get back to their offices, we'll start seeing more of that for transit lanes. In a lot of cities, we're not going to be able to accommodate people in cars. So we're going to have to find a way to make buses and trains move efficiently again. And to do that, we're going to need to take some space. And that will allow us to run more frequent service and allow people to feel safer on the bus and start to create a renaissance and recovery for transit agencies.
That's a hopeful note. How about our other Chris Pangilinan?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'll start with my negative also, so we can end on a positive. Just like trans agencies, I think you're seeing a lot of shared mobility companies having to really zero in and focus on getting through the next year, the next couple of years. And this means seeing less potential innovation, maybe less focus on, well, we've already seen pool be cut, pool-like services be cut. And so it's a double whammy on the lack of people needing to aggregate to create pool in the first place, but also the social distancing norms that are happening right now. So hopefully we can get this back on the streets, but right now that's going to be a drag on the shared mobility innovation. On the plus side, though, like the other speakers have said, this is kind of a forcing function on innovation, and I think we're going to see a lot more weaving of the system, if you will, between public transportation and private sector, as everyone works together to make sure that there is not a huge rush to private cars. We've already seen the FTA and the federal government get involved with funding on the emergency basis, and potentially we'll see more of that and mobility management take place to keep the whole shared mobility system, transit and private, together.
Thank you. All right, Dillon, let's close out our lightning round.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. So my first point would be safety. And I think transit's safety has always been a important kind of hallmark of transit, but increasingly moving forward, both for riders and other teammates and drivers and other teammates, and also to get riders back on the system. Transit agencies and cities are going to increasingly have to convey a very comprehensive safety program. And I think that's going to be true for the mid to long term here. It's going to be a critical factor with how quickly riders return to transit systems. And the second point, sort of following up on something that Kim and a couple others noted, is that I think this is also an opportunity for transit agencies and cities to push through reforms and look at their systems in a comprehensive way that they hadn't been able to before. Now, the timing under which they're doing that is going to be very limited, but it really allows for some changes that were coming slowly to be enacted quickly. And I think in a little bit of a self-serving but comment that I can back up with some good anecdotes is that technology is really the only way you're going to be able to do this. I think whether you're looking at dynamic and flexible networks, tracking riders, giving proper physical distancing and seat spacing, you're not going to be able to do that without putting technology on the system. And I think increasingly we're seeing, we've got a couple dozen cities that we're working with now to put it in on demand as a key piece of their network, not looking at sort of a standalone project, but something that is integrated into the overall network. Thinking less about route design and more about how are you delivering services to riders. So are you supplementing either on demand for night or weekend or underperforming fixed routes or areas so that you can provide that differentiated service to riders. And at the end of the day, all agencies are seeing that empty fixed routes, buses are not affected, right? And the driver can't look back at each stop and count how many people are getting on and police that. It puts a huge strain on the drivers and operators, and it's just a very poor quality of experience. And so I think in many ways, this is a great opportunity for cities to sort of rethink how they're doing this.
That's great. Well, I think that this lightning round actually teed up a lot of the topics that we're going to dive into in more depth in this discussion. So thank you for that great palette teaser. For this first section of the discussion, I want to really focus in on public transit, because we know that's the granddaddy of shared mobility and the backbone of any system that is supplemented by private services. So I want to start this first question directed probably most at Chris Van Eyken and at David, because you've really been through the paces and working in public transit agencies and the challenges they face. So, in the short term, we know that the crisis has hobbled the fiscal health of a lot of agencies that have seen fare box revenue drop through the basement and are stuck with a lot of new costs that they have to deal with around providing service during this time, while their operators may be less available than they typically are. But after the crisis ends, how do you think the long-term financial stability of transit agencies and their ability to provide quality service will be affected? And specifically, do you think that this event will actually increase or decrease public support for transit funding? What do you think that kind of long-term financial picture is going to look like, and the political picture?
I think in terms of increasing or decreasing, it's fairly uncertain. I think Transit Center research has found that CARES Act funding will last the largest agencies about 5 to 8 months of budget shortfalls. And earlier this week at the MBTA Official Management and Control Board meeting, they announced that they only expect fare revenue to reach 60% of pre-crisis levels by June 2021. So that's going pretty far out, where we're going to see reduced budgets, and that will have cascading effects. But I do think that city leadership across the US understands that public transit is really the backbone of building healthy, sustainable cities. And so we're going to have to find a way to keep funding levels high to normal, what we saw pre-crisis, just to ensure that our cities recover and have sort of that robust activity we saw before coronavirus hit.
Mm-hmm. And do you worry that if people indeed are fleeing the system as riders to some degree, that as more people opt out of that system, at least over the next couple of years while we're kind of actively in the management of this pandemic, that will erode the willingness of voters to pay for additional transit funding in the form of things like sales tax measures or other publicly funded revenue sources? Or do you think that this moment is actually a time when people will say, government needs to step in and shore up transit and actually allocate those resources to a degree we haven't seen in the past?
Yeah, I can't give a certain answer, but I would say that polling that we did with Data for Progress on the Green New Deal for transportation found that most of the general public is willing to spend a lot more money on transit than we currently do. So I think that bodes well for a recovery where we see a lot more money going to transit agencies to support sustainability. I would add to that, though, that at the same time, IBM released a survey earlier this week finding that 20% of current bus and train riders are reluctant to go back to public transit in the short term. So I think we're going to have to find a way to make sure riders feel safe on transit if we're going to build up the political support to keep transit agencies whole.
Mm-hmm. David, or any of the other panelists, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's another question here, which is, are the things that are happening now things that are going to continue over the course of the next 2 years? Transit agencies have made huge changes in response to a crisis in ways that they haven't before. We at Transit App, we get like the 3rd level down when they've done all of that, and then they've tried to change their data and they can't figure out how to change their data so they can actually communicate all these service changes that they've made. But we see it relatively constantly. But I think there is something that's really interesting here, which is for the first time in almost 4 decades, transit agencies are actually getting operating assistance from the federal government. And that's a fundamental change in the model. And if that continues, that could keep us from a system where we are investing in new projects. And, you know, I wouldn't say any capital spent on transit is excessive, but perhaps both more capital and more operating are needed. And we haven't had an increase in operating costs in a very long time. So the fact that the federal government is beginning to think about this and did it as part of the CARES Act, I think is huge, and especially if it keeps up afterward.
Yeah, that's a great point. So if we think more specifically about transit operations, we know that, you know, there are some very significant operational changes that agencies have made during this immediate period. We've seen drastic reductions in service, removal of lines in lower ridership areas in the short term to reallocate vehicles onto some of the essential corridors so that they can provide, you know, more vehicles, allow people to be physically spaced out. I'm sure there are, you know, a variety of responses that agencies of different types have taken across the country. I'm curious, you know, which of any of these changes you think it's likely may actually be maintained after we come out of this immediate crisis? Like, how do we think that long-term kind of trends in service planning, coverage, frequency, allocation of transit, you know, vehicles and service across the system might be shaped by this period?
I'll take a first crack, but I'm sure Chris has thoughts as well. So I think that the answer is buses and more buses. I think the answer has always been buses. You know, buses have promised flexibility since they were ripping up streetcars, but we can make that work. I mean, take a look at the work that Jeff Tumlin and the team did in San Francisco. Take a look at what's going on elsewhere. We can fundamentally change the system and focus on, you know, these modes that have the flexibility to change, to keep up with changing origin and destination patterns. And part of that includes the sort of emergency microtransit services that, you know, VIA and others have helped agencies spin up, and how you integrate that in. But really fundamentally, it's about more bus service. And I don't see that changing. I see that expanding over time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think running a bus frequently, there's just no replacement for that. So we'll continue to see frequent corridors where you're running lots of buses to ensure that you can do social distancing and keep people safe. I think there'll be openness to using new methods to dispatching those buses. So I don't think this will be minivans or anything of that sort. I think it will still be 40-footers and 60-footers. But we might look to, on our most frequent corridors, getting away from schedule-based headways and do more active dispatching that respond to changes in demand and changes in traffic along corridors.
Interesting. You know, we know that the populations that are most really severely affected by changes in transit service are often vulnerable populations, folks who are dependent on transit to get them around for their daily mobility needs and don't have the economic ability to opt out like more privileged folks may be able to do. And I'm curious, you know, what folks think about what cities and transit agencies can do during this time when they're making really rapid operational changes, removing service in some areas, reallocating it. How can they actually make sure that equity is considered in these service changes and incorporate feedback about the needs of those populations at a time when outreach is more difficult than ever? Kim, I was thinking you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as has already been mentioned with San Francisco, my understanding is that they shifted some of their routes and priorities to the most essential and vulnerable populations. And I think that that is probably a great model. We have seen the departure of a lot of discretionary riders at this point, and they're probably going to stay away for a little while. And I think what you have remaining are the people who are not discretionary. And so if there was any doubt before which of your lines, which of your routes were the most critical and essential for those vulnerable populations, we now have that data. I think that there needs to be an in-depth look at what these trips are looking like. Just because a person might be able to get from point A to point B still doesn't mean that that trip is taking the same amount of time as it did before. And it's probably taking a lot longer as you see cities that have reduced service to Sunday schedules and that sort of thing. And so my hope would be that transit agencies would take this opportunity to do some passenger tales and try to engage directly with individuals, not only for the transit routes themselves, but also the facilities. You see people still queuing at bus stops. It is hard to maintain social distance in a safe distance when you have a bus stop that might not even be ADA compliant. And so I think that this is also an opportunity, not only when you're looking at the routing, but also to look at the infrastructure and facilities that you're applying. And if there is a consolidation that has to take place and a reduction in service, maybe there's also a reinvestment in stops themselves to make them work better for those folks who are going to continue to use them.
Mm-hmm. And are there effective new ways that transit agencies or cities, in some of your other decisions that you're making during this time, have found to incorporate public input and outreach despite the inability to hold traditional public meetings?
I think that the city of Pittsburgh and the Port Authority of Allegheny County, which operates the transit service within Pittsburgh, has had a really good record with kind of engaging people where they're at. So I have walked down the sidewalks of Pittsburgh and seen signs at the bus stops themselves that are like, this is being considered for consolidation. If you have an opinion about that, contact us here. Or in the T stations, a direct phone number to a human being who really wants your feedback. And I think so often that type of information and getting that contact into the hands of the people who really want to use it has never been as straightforward. And so I think modeling after, hey, we see that there are a ton of people getting on this route at these times and these stops. Let's actually put some signage out there and make sure that it's a phone number and not just a website for folks who don't have access to the internet, but also make it accessible from texting so that people don't have to talk to you if they don't want to. Stand up an easy survey that people can access using their phones, or if they have online access, doing that too. So I'm just a huge fan of being able to capture the people that you're trying to reach by getting them at the facilities that they're already using.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point that like public meetings were never like the sufficient way to get feedback. We know there's such a sort of overrepresentation of more privileged groups that attend those meetings anyway. And so maybe a positive development from this is that a lot, agencies will kind of be forced to learn how to do more of that, ways of meeting people where they are to get their input through this, rather than relying on some of those traditional mechanisms.
And we found with some of our, even though there's still meetings and you still have to find out that they are happening, with the virtual meetings, we've had communities that are used to seeing 5 to 10 people show up that are now seeing 40 people attend, because now the barrier of transportation, the barrier of childcare, the barrier of not wanting to leave your house after a long day on the job or before you have to go to a night shift, those are now dissolved. And so I think that even when we can bring people together in public, we need to make sure that we have these other opportunities available for people to participate from the comforts of their own home. Because even when we're in the green phase and we think it's very safe for people to be near each other, there are still going to be people who have their own factors that make it so that they're going to want to stay away from people, for lack of a better way to say it. And so I want to make sure that, at least in our city, that we're continuing to make those opportunities available.
That's great. Dillon, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just add pile on to what Kim said, and also something that David and Chris said before. I think ensuring equity of access to vulnerable populations is a key piece of this sort of transformation. And if you think about kind of doubling down just on more buses, running empty fixed route lines is not going to get either these vulnerable populations access to transit that they need, nor is it going to be efficient for transit agencies. And so I think technology is really the only way you can do this. Kim brought up a really good point about queues at stops. If you're limiting access to buses to, some agencies are doing between 25 and 50% of max capacity on these buses, you can't run 4 times as many buses, and then you risk having people in vulnerable populations sitting at these stops for extended periods of time, not knowing when they're going to be able to get on, in addition to sort of the issues with riders, drivers policing the number of riders. And so I think taking a comprehensive look at that rider experience and using technology to leverage better efficiency and being a little more flexible on how you allocate supply to meet this kind of uneven and demand during rebound will be key. And it also gives, as I'm sure David would agree, it gives you a way to reach out to your riders that many transit agencies aren't used to, right? If you've got digital access with them for a large proportion of your riders, and others you can provide phone booking and other accessible means for them to have the same quality of service. It really gives you a way to communicate with your riders around some of these dynamic service changes that you don't have in other situations.
David, I know Transit has been collecting a lot of interesting data about ridership patterns during this period, and even kind of demographic trends in that data during the crisis. What have you guys observed that bears on the impacts of this on vulnerable populations? You're on mute, FYI. Oh no, you're still on mute.
I'm good.
Oh,
So,
there you are.
Hi everybody. Still learning how to use the internet. So yeah, we've seen demand drop by about 75 or 80%. We've been publishing these stats live, up to the hour at transitapp.com/coronavirus. Basically, it's been relatively stable for the last 6 weeks or so in terms of that 75 to 80% drop. It obviously varies by place. What you see, and I think Kim pointed to this before, is that the most popular lines have changed. They're now located in lower income neighborhoods and near medical centers, and that's true sort of universally, whatever city you're looking in. We also ran a survey of people who are still using the app. We got about 25,000 responses. The answers aren't going to surprise you, even though I wish they would, because they divide along the lines of like race and language and gender and income. Obviously, people who are still riding are mostly essential workers, healthcare support, food service, even construction. Much more likely to be women than before. In Philly, more than 2/3 of our app users are now women, up from a relatively even split. This is because of who's riding. White people are more likely to have stopped riding, meaning people riding are now disproportionately Black and brown. In places like Los Angeles, English speakers have left transit at nearly twice the proportion of people who speak Spanish have their phone set, in Spanish. Almost 3/4 of the riders who are out there make less than $50,000 a year, as opposed to about half normally, according to APTA. So yeah, there's big effects, and there's huge equity effects in terms of who is opting out or who can work from home, et cetera, that we're seeing right now.
That is fascinating. And I think it's a good moment to turn our attention to the question of what transit can do after the immediate crisis ends to attract riders back, and to make sure that it's not left as a system that is solely used by non-discretionary riders, and that political support is eroded for it. I think a lot of us fear that, and we fear what that would mean for broader public support for transit funding. And so, Chris Van Eyken, I think this would be a great moment to hear from you about sort of what you think transit agencies can do to kind of prepare themselves to bring riders back and to make riders feel safe using transit again in the next 8 months, 2 years.
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure passengers feel safe, make sure that operators feel safe so they create a welcome environment for those passengers. I think we'll likely see mask requirements on a lot of systems for the next year or so. We'll start seeing hand sanitizers placed at train stations and busy bus stops. Longer term, agency planning is just going to have to take pandemics into mind. Just as post-Sandy, we saw a lot of agencies start to adopt hurricane plans. And that will mean changing things about our bus and train design to make sure that they are less likely to be vectors for transmission. A big thing there is improving HVAC systems so they're not just recycling air, they're bringing in fresh air, not virus-tainted air that can infect a full bus if one person gets on. We'll also see increased use of technology for that. The MTA here in New York is starting to experiment with using UV lights to disinfect buses and trains. I know some systems in Asia use that post-SARS and have seen some success with it. So I think this is a time for trying a lot of different things, but we need to make sure transit feels safe and find the best recommendations for public health experts. And after that, transit ridership was going down before COVID. So agencies are going to have to get back to doing what they do well, providing frequent service that arrives on time. It's not bunched, it's reliable, and people can count on it to get them to work on time.
So some have suggested that during this period and as we come out of it, that there's a likelihood that agencies will increasingly start to partner with on-demand private providers like Via or like traditional TNCs like Lyft and Uber to allow them to reallocate service onto more critical routes and provide less fixed route service in low ridership areas. I think we heard that idea from Dillon earlier. And I'm curious how the panel reacts to that idea. Do you think that that will actually happen? Is there evidence of that happening yet? I think maybe we saw at least one example out of Miami with late night service doing that. How big of a phenomenon is that likely to be in reality?
I'm happy to go ahead, Chris.
Dylan. Oh, thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I think what we're seeing here is this being a forcing function on what has always been a side pilot and question about whether will this work. And I think we've seen it in Miami now with late night service. Indigo just partnered with Uber to do countywide access to work services. And I think what we're going to see is transit agencies exploring whether technology companies can be an asset to them to expand service, to provide targeted on-demand services to complement their fixed route service. Unfortunately, it has to come at this time when we are under a budget pressure for all companies and agencies. But one thing that we can think of transit agencies as, we've always thought about this idea of mobility management. And if you think of a transit agency sort of like as a manufacturer of access to opportunity, they deliver bus service and train service. What they're really doing is providing their city with access to social and economic opportunity. And the question is, how do they take public dollars and revenue dollars, turn that into sausage making, if you will, crank that in their box, and out comes access to opportunity. The tools at their trade have always been buses and trains, and going forward, that's going to be the main tool also. But now, unlike in 2008, 2009, all of a sudden they have this network of TNCs. They have companies like Via, who do software as a service and other services, to eventually allow them to create even better sausage, if you will. Likely they'll be still relying mostly on buses and trains because that's the best way to get people around, ideally combined with bus lanes and other things to make it fast and frequent. But there are going to be opportunities like Miami and Indigo have seen, Innisfil, Ontario, of course, very famous for this as well, Pinellas County, to use technology. And I think we'll see this accelerate, and I'm hoping that transit agencies and technology companies can really work together to provide the best service possible for their people.
Dillon, looks like you had a thought on that as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with Chris. I think we've got almost 40 services running globally with cities and transit agencies where they had existing services that they've adapted to either emergency workers or goods delivery in terms of meals or PPE or other essential equipment. And then I think working on what is the sort of public transit 2.0, public transit of the future look like. We've got a couple services that we've launched, one in Abu Dhabi where we're replacing fixed line off-peak nights and weekends. And then we were working with Transport for Wales to launch a nationwide app for them to do the same thing. And we're launching 3 or 4 more cities here in the next few days at a total system level in some cases, where on demand will supplement this. And if you look at running 200 underperforming fixed route buses where you're providing a very low quality of service at an extremely high cost, there's really no substitute for putting in technology. Now, what does that look like in the future? I think is as David pointed out, no one really knows, but there's no way that services can seek to grow and bring riders back on, not only for the microtransit rides or that sort of on-demand service, but how are you going to attract riders back onto your system more generally? The expectations are a lot higher now, and so I think you have to think about rider experience in a much different way, like we do on the consumer side, or like Uber and Lyft. Sort of how are you attracting riders to your service, and thinking about what that does for overall service health, not just the rides themselves on microtransit.
Can I chime in for a second?
Please.
So my earlier comment when we were going around during the lightning round and saying one positive, one negative, when I said innovation, this is what I meant. I meant using the brains and the algorithms and the scripts that organizations like VIA have come up with to be more strategic about how you use your resources. Some transit agencies have smaller vehicles that might not be used right now. They might have paratransit sort of cutaways that they could use on an on-demand sort of service, but they may not have sort of that routing and on-demand platform to be able to utilize them really well. And so that's what I would really hope to see out of this when we have to be more strategic, because maybe we can't run the number of vehicles we once could. How do we best use the ones we have? And this idea of leveraging private partnerships has been around for decades. You know, paratransit services in Arlington County 15 years ago were working with red top cabs to dispatch trips that they couldn't accommodate or that were better served by the cab company. And so I don't think that this is a new model. I think it's just one that has the potential to be way more cost effective than it ever was because of the technology that Dillon and others keep referencing.
David, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's all right. And I think the thing that we have to make sure that we do this time around as opposed to last time around, because I think paratransit and dial-a-ride is a nice comparison here, is to make sure it's really part of an integrated whole of the system rather than this thing that's off in the corner. Because paratransit and dial-a-ride were great, but now they cost $53 a ride in most places. So how do we make sure that this is something that actually brings the benefits that we want to bring? And as people actually will take the rest of public transit as well, can act as feeder systems into other places, or can, be integrated into the holistic experience rather than setting up on their own as these separate services, which unfortunately is the stage of development that we're at right now. So I'm hopeful that over the course of the next couple of years, we'll be able to make it something that's integrated. And maybe it won't work. And I think we also have to be ready to accept that this is an experiment, and some of them will fail. Having worked at Bridge Low those many years ago, we were the original folks who failed at a couple of these. And I think that there's been a lot of learnings that came from that, so that people are succeeding in different ways and failing in different ways now. And I think we have to be not afraid to fail now, so that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, they can succeed.
Emily, if I can just one quick follow-up to that. I think Dave makes a good point, and I think not advocating to lay trolley tracks through the center of town, coming up with some kind of flexible platform so that we can change for the next pandemic or the next service disruption is really key. I think giving transit agencies this flexible platform that they can change as demographic trends change, as their needs change, is really key, and it can't be through single occupancy vehicles. I think for some of this, as ridership decreases, it's been a great need. Chris referenced the work they've done in Miami. It's a great example. But going forward for the long term, I think everybody sort of recognizes that if we throw several million more single occupancy vehicles on the street here in New York, it's over. And so really got to think about how do we use technology and how do we ensure safety on shared rides of vehicles of any size.
And
Chris Van Eyken.
Yeah, just to jump in before you move on, I would say that on-demand microtransit is a great option for replacing paratransit service. It's a lot cheaper. It's worked out well in a lot of cities. But so far as replacing bus routes, even coverage routes that have lower frequency, we've seen experiments already with LA Metro and Seattle KC Metro, where we've replaced them with on-demand vehicles, and they have had some success. But the per rider cost is still higher than those buses that appear to be empty but are still carrying some passengers. So I think as agencies look to do these pilots, they need to be very careful, especially on a short budget, and make sure that there is a strong measure of cost effectiveness before they get rid of that regular bus route people rely on.
Yeah, I do think that that's a challenge, and on the one hand, you have a model like what you just described with King County Metro, which I think is a VIA system. And when you have dedicated vehicles that are performing that kind of a microtransit service, it's harder to bring the per passenger cost down. Now, on the other hand, if you do a TNC type partnership service, it's much easier to accomplish an affordable per passenger cost. But a problem that we've seen in some of those partnerships, as I recall from ones that I worked on at Lyft and seen how they've developed even after I've left, is that they're so good that they induce a lot of demand for the program. So you look at the city of Santa Monica, I think Monrovia also in Southern California, they offered some really great service levels on on-demand subsidized rides done in partnership with the cities or transit agencies, but then it busted the city's budget for that program because so many people were willing to use them. And so it requires some type of almost service rationing to be put into place to prevent overconsumption. I'm curious sort of how can a transit agency thread that needle to make these types of services viable?
Yeah, Emily, I think that's a great point. And I think we saw a little bit of that too in Innisfil. There were a couple of City Lab articles about the Uber partnership in Innisfil, Ontario, which for some of you that aren't familiar is a town of about 30,000 north of Toronto, in Ontario. And I think one of the ways that we were to help that we were able to work with the town on this, and I think the other instances can look at this, including paratransit, because paratransit has the exact same problem, is how do we look at a way of rationing? It could be either pricing or trip limits or some kind of way of creating the system such that it serves its intended purpose. And I think with fixed route services, especially the low frequency ones, unfortunately, you have negative service rationing where the service is just so unusable that people just don't use it. And so we don't want that. We want to make it useful for people such that they can get to their destinations, their work and social opportunities, but also say, look, we can't, unfortunately, have people riding it 14 days a week. Or if you do, there has to be an escalated fair price to make sure that we're able to give it to everybody who needs it most. And I'm not saying we have the answer yet. I think this is going to be an interesting way of innovating and learning together between the public and private sector to figure out what is the best way to price and put the service out there for paratransit and non-paratransit trips to get the most benefits without unduly either restricting the service or making the service intentionally bad to restrict it. We don't want to do either of those things.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay, we've talked a lot about transit, so I want to shift for the rest of our discussion to talking about a couple of other modes of shared mobility and the private modes. And Chris Pangilinan, why don't we stay with you and talk about how TNCs are being affected during this period? You know, everybody knows I worked at Lyft for a really long time, and it's been extremely sad over the last couple of weeks to see, what's happened with the layoffs, and there are obviously rumors, but so far unconfirmed, that similar things may be in the works at Uber. I'd love to just hear from you, sort of, your outlook about how Uber's business is being affected by this, and whether you think that there are going to be long-term changes to the model that result from this, or whether this is just a short-term kind of scaling down but maintaining business as usual. How is Uber going to be shaped by this in the longer term?
Yeah, I think it's obviously no secret that ridership on all of our systems is way down. And so this definitely affects revenue and the ability to put a business out there. And so I think we're going to see this from a lot of mobility companies, is the focus on making sure that these companies are well positioned to get through this crisis, to be able to keep their bikes and scooters on the street, to keep the technology running for shared rides and TNC ride hailing kind of services. And that means focusing on making sure that the service out there is contributing to the bottom line, or at least not detracting significantly from it. And so I think what we'll see longer term, though, I think that shared mobility can come out of this in a good, strong position. I think this, again, going back to my favorite phrase of today, a forcing function again, of ensuring that companies like mine, like others, are focusing on what makes their companies work. Focusing on the geographies and cities and areas that contribute to the business, that make it work. And so I think you're going to see some things fall by the wayside. But other things like, including transit partnerships, I think be strengthened. I think there's recognition in the company and then across the industry that these kind of partnerships with public sector entities, in order to enable agencies to provide better service, are also good for companies like Uber, like Lyft, like Via. And I think that these kind of partnerships will continue to grow and expand. So I'm hopeful in that regard, but we do have a few months, and hopefully only a few months, of tough times to get through, maybe longer, before we can come out of this and I think start that innovation wheel again, or at least accelerate that innovation wheel again on how do we get more people to share cars in pools like services? How do we get more green vehicles on the road? How do we tackle the issues of congestion together with congestion pricing? All these things that might look like they're on pause for now, or at least decelerating, coming back.
Yeah, you said some things you think Uber may have to leave by the wayside during this kind of period as you focus in on your most like kind of core services are the ones that are most feasible for the business moving forward. What do you think those areas are that are going to be the most challenging to maintain?
Yeah, I think it's going to be continually evaluated over the next month or so as we see how things shake out. It's hard for me to say because I just don't know where it's going to end up right now. I mean, I have a lot of faith in our work in public transportation. I have a lot of faith in our work in getting shared rides back on the street as soon as we can, as soon as it's, culturally appropriate to do that, and safe, of course. But I think it's going to be a we'll see kind of, we will see kind of thing.
Do you expect that this could affect Uber's ability to continue to provide service coverage in lower demand areas, smaller communities or rural communities, or is that not one of the type of things that you think?
No, I don't think, I don't think it will. I think the beauty of the TNC style service is that where there's demand is where drivers will go to get earnings. And so as long as demand can stay there, we'll see people being picked up. I mean, I think we saw this in New York City, especially in other areas where we had that outer borough effect where taxi service was very difficult to come by. But now you can get an Uber in less than 5 minutes in outer Queens or outer, northern part of the Bronx, whereas before a taxi cab would never take you to Brooklyn, for example. And so I think that stays. It might shrink a little bit depending on demand. If rural demand drops a little bit, or if there's not as much aggregation of demand out there. But for the most part, I'm not too worried about that going away.
Got it. I'm curious if we were to get out our crystal balls, how we expect that TNC mode share is going to look on the other side of this. Because I think you could make arguments in multiple directions, and I don't know which one is going to be true. But in the short term, obviously, we're seeing a huge hit. People are afraid of shared rides, or even a ride with a driver in a small vehicle during a period like this when they're so worried about contagion. But we've also talked about the idea that there might be a shift away from high capacity transit, which obviously is not a positive development. It's not something we'd like to see, but that there could be an argument made that TNCs would be a beneficiary of that kind of mode shift if, being in a sedan with one other person feels safer than being in a bus with 80 other people. And so I'm curious what anyone of the panelists think about sort of how we need to plan around that, because in the short term, TNCs are very compromised by this situation, and we don't want them to disappear, but we also have to be prepared for mode shifts moving forward. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can start. I'm curious what the rest of the panel thinks too. I don't think it's going to be as pronounced as we are worried about. I think the real fear is the loss of all shared mobility to the private car, this is probably more of a neutral thing, like David was hinting at, the work from home phenomenon. I think that if you look at the pricing of transit versus a TNC, TNCs are easily 3 to 4x more cost per trip in an unsubsidized area, and so you might see substitution here and there, but I think 5 days a week, 4 days a week, we're not going to be seeing people going from a $2.75 bus to a $10 or more Uber Lyft situation. But I think what we'll potentially see is people, and hopefully not, but leaving from this multimodal pie of transit, TNC, walking, biking to this single modal pie of private automobile. And we want the flow to go the other way. We want people to go from the private automobile to the shared, different multimodal system. And so I think it's going to take a lot of work on the policy side, congestion pricing in other areas, as well as on all of us to make our service as best as possible to keep that flow from going that direction.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I do think there's a substantial concern about kind of retrenchment in personal car ownership during this period. So before we move on to active transportation as the final portion of our discussion, I just want to touch in on pooled rides for a minute, because we brought that up tangentially a couple times in this conversation and talked about, how it seems like it's going to be difficult for the immediate future for us to get multiple parties to share a single vehicle, obviously in transit, but also in the pooled ride options that Uber offers or in Vias. grouped rides, putting multiple individuals into that type of a vehicle. You know, what do we think the transition is going to look like to get back to a model where we can accommodate that? Dillon, I'd love to kind of hear from you about sort of operationally and from a customer experience perspective, how you think you can entice individuals to share a small vehicle like that with people they don't know.
I think it's less about sort of the vehicle type, and it's more about being able to provide that experience, whether you're doing some type of pre-booking or on demand with larger vehicles and limiting capacity on those vehicles. I think there's no question that cities and transit agencies are increasingly going to look at congestion pricing. If you look at what New York's done here, pooled rides have a discount over single occupancy vehicle rides for all the TNCs, and there are definitely ways you can drive, you know, literally and figuratively, rider behavior into more constructive, sort of long-term sustainable ways. I think pooling, again, is the only way, whether it's, you know, regardless of who's providing it, getting multiple occupancy of these vehicles of any size is the only way we're going to be able to solve this problem. Now, you have to do it in an equitable and affordable and sustainable way, but I think some of the earlier points on, you know, cost per ride are valid, and I think looking at microtransit in general as a piece of your system, not a standalone deployment, you know, as David and Chris have mentioned, is important. I think the other piece is you need to attract a new category of riders to transit, right? And some of these, you know, some of our services, we see 300-400% rider increase over the prior fixed route. Now, if you get rid of that on-demand service, you're not going to maintain that level of ridership. You're going to lose those riders. They're going to go to alternative means. And so you need to look at sort of the total cost, not just on the per ride, but what are the soft costs in terms of congestion, increase in single occupancy vehicles, environmental impact. I think, you know, and CARB does this in California, there are different ways of looking at the impacts of getting multiple passengers into these vehicles. But I think the only way is through cities kind of enforcing some of this rider behavior. We've had some early conversations. I think most cities and transit agencies are just trying to figure out how to get through the next few weeks and what that looks like as things start ramping up. Safety, service design, and then they'll have time to sort of judge what the long-term impacts are. Some of the points about work from home, how many people are actually going to come back to some of these urban centers, and what's the density going to be like in some of these office buildings? That's going to have a huge impact on here in New York, cities like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. So I think congestion pricing will be one way, but I think right now cities are really concerned with getting people back to work. And so putting some kind of punitive price on that until there's an issue, I don't think a lot of cities are, at least we haven't seen a lot of those conversations yet.
Yeah, agreed. So I want to shift gears now and talk a little bit about infrastructure and about active transportation. You know, I'm thinking about street design and how that changes in this moment, because, you know, we saw it during the last Great Recession, that coming out of it was this amazing movement around tactical urbanism that has already shifted the conversation of how we use our city streets. And now during this crisis, we're seeing a wave of cities adopting slow streets policies where they're closing streets to car traffic, or at least through car traffic, and opening them up to bicyclists and pedestrians. And Kim, I'm curious about your thoughts on this, you know, from your vantage, having worked on managing city streets and active transportation. Do you expect that this is actually going to create any kind of a lasting movement for car-free streets? What might we see carried forward after the end of the immediate pandemic from these efforts?
I think what's sort of interesting is that there will not be an immediate end to the pandemic. And I think that there are going to be so many lasting effects. You know, when I'm thinking and we're talking about how transit and ridership's being impacted, we haven't really talked about the fact that because there's a lot of cities reallocating public space, there's going to be way less parking that's available, especially in major destination corridors when businesses, dine-in is reestablished. And so I think that there might be, it's a really interesting time where there's so many variables that are getting impacted all at once. You know, the commute has changed because a lot of people aren't making a commute. A lot of times people would choose to take TNCs if they're going out drinking, for example. Bars are not open. And so, and the physical environment is changing. So I know that's a little bit of an aside and a carryover from my thoughts from the past topic, but it's just rare to see so many different variables change all at once. But to get to the active transportation point, what we see in Pittsburgh are people riding bikes that have probably been sitting in their garages for years. I think that this has been an opportunity because of the lack of other recreational options available to get, to bring people back in. And with the streets being naturally a bit less congested, a chance for people to really see what the future could be like if less people were driving and if streets were more comfortable to have active transportation modes on them. So I do think that there's going to be a lasting effect in the minds of hopefully people that are moving around our cities, because they're getting to experience what a different reality is like that we could not have provided through any planning document before. People have the opportunity to live this now. I think that this may have been the catalyst, for pickup drop-off activity. We've already seen how on-demand food delivery and those sorts of businesses have changed the way people are accessing a lot of retail establishments. And I think that with COVID streets is the time that we're using to reallocate some of that public space to better serve the changing marketplace. So I do think that a lot of these were sort of trends and interests that might have been underlying, and this was finally the catalyst for those changes to get made, which means that they have a good potential of sticking around even when traditional dine-in establishments open back up or other retail establishments. I think we're going to see not only that people like it, they like some of these changes and they're going to advocate for them to stay this way. And also a continuation of just the need for more social distancing and more space to be available for pedestrians and active transportation as a result of continued concern about this current illness and future ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point. It's not going to end suddenly. It's like, oh, okay, COVID's over now, guys. Switch it back on, right? It'll be a gradual ramp back up to normal activity, and perhaps that means that there can also be kind of a way of phasing some of these temporary programs into more permanent programs, at least in some degree. So let's talk about shared micromobility, because this has been a really hard time for scooter providers and bike share providers. And, obviously the travel demand has fallen through the bottom for them as well. They've had some, concerns that they've had to address around having shared surfaces on their devices. And some of them have chosen to stop operating during this period of time. We don't know yet whether they're all going to come back into the same markets that they were before. However, it's pretty clear that the business model was already on tenuous footing even before this crisis hit. And so I'm curious, what folks think about the likelihood that that model, the kind of privately driven, permitted shared scooter model is going to be viable in the long term. Like, are we really going to see it continue in the form that we had it before? Kim, I might punt that back to you because you were a regulator when you were at DDOT.
Opinions on this. I think if you had asked this question of me a year ago, I think I would have had the same answer, which is I don't know that the business model is super viable. We saw the entrance of dockless bikes in September of 2017 in Washington, D.C., and the exit of most of those dockless bikes months later from not just our city, but all over the U.S. I think some scooter companies have seen the same thing. Having, experience in a city, in a municipally owned and run public bike sharing system that is successful, Capital Bike Share, I have an insight into what the finances look like, and it is public transportation, and public transportation is not known for turning a profit, at least not in the United States. So I think, the city of Pittsburgh's model, which as many people on this call probably recognize, scooters are not street legal in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So we do not have any shared scooter fleets on the streets right now, but we have been actively engaged in the Pittsburgh Mobility Collective, where we're working with different providers in the marketplace to try to come up with a solution and try to work on the legislative barriers at the same time. And we actually think that right now is a great time to make the case. There is some concern about shared surfaces. I think it's a lot easier to wash your hands after taking an outdoor ride on one vehicle by yourself than it is to kind of wrap your head around what it's like to be in a shared contained space. And so I think we see that there's value for providing any additional two-wheel mobility, especially for folks that are essential workers, you know, trying to focus on healthcare providers and grocery store essential employees, and knowing that with the reduction in transit services, that these trips still need to be made. And so affordable options, especially given the last question about reallocating public streets and public space for safer active transportation, it's all going hand in hand, at least in our city and probably a lot others. So I think your original question was on a viability of a business model. I think without public participation, where we really make the case for it, and possibly some investment, whether that's through infrastructure or other, maybe not super viable, but a bridged approach, just like we're talking about with TNCs and transit and those other sorts of collaboration, I think that there's a potential. And I know that most cities want to do whatever they can to get people on 2 and 3 wheels and out of their cars. And so that's something that many cities are very interested in seeing survive and thrive.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what happens next is a combination of circumstances, but what we, you know, is, I think Kim was really eloquent about, it's about what we choose. But I do think we have to think about things in stealing from, you know, another Warren. I'm for big structural change with all of this. Entities like that are actually working together, and not just sort of a coalition of the willing, which is a great beginning, but I think something that we need to move beyond. So that's cities, transit agencies, mobility companies, and then folks like us as supporters in the background. They're interesting models. You know, Pittsburgh, obviously, in the, you know, mobility, you know, consortium there that we're part of is great. Folks like Dayton running their own scooter systems directly with Spin, I think, are really interesting, and thinking about these really as extensions. But I think for the systems that are out there, you know, the question is this really the time, or will this be the time to invest in the future with, you know, promotions, free rides, sort of all of those typical things that we can do at this moment where habits are changing. We've all been inside for 8 weeks and 10 weeks, and it'll be another however long. That's the time when you can really change habits. Like where is the pitch to change this? If you're a private scooter company, you should be actively reaching out to your local transit agency and vice versa to figure out how you supplement the service, how you position the fleets where crowding is a problem, figure out how to honor their fares if the buses are too crowded, you know, set the groundwork for these long-term collaborations where it's really part of a system together that look to the bikes and scooters as something that's cost effective for first mile, last mile solutions. And God forbid that some of these areas might actually be lower income areas. You know, I think that there's this real opportunity now for these companies, if they're going to continue to exist, to prove that they're not just paying lip service to equity goals going forward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's right. And I think that if we see micromobility as another tool in the toolbox, just like buses, just like trains, just like TNCs, this is another thing that cities could take advantage of. If they're not being, if for some reason private companies aren't putting them out there, if they don't see a way to make money on it or whatever, then there's still potential for them to be in a partnership with cities. Because I think bikes and scooters are just like, you know, if we just look at them on their own, they're one of the greatest ways that we can get around our cities in a green way, say in a space efficient way. And if we can find them to make them, and if we can put out even accessible bikes or accessible scooters, we can even be more inclusive. And I think if cities can find ways to using their power of their budget or power of their the pen or both to get these devices out there and available to everybody, that plus the transit system plus potential TNC partnerships, all this stuff together can make it again prevent that return to private vehicles that we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that given our time here is a great moment to shift to some questions from our attendees before we wrap this up. So looking at all the questions that have come in here, we have a lot. We're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them. But, you know, I'm going to go here to first the question from the top here from Anna. It's about VIA. It's asking about kind of your service in Seattle. Dillon, are you able to see that question?
Yeah.
Do you want to chime in on kind of, you know, addressing the effects on your service in Seattle during the pandemic, and how you view continuity of service when you're partnered with a public agency?
Yeah, so in all of these cases, again, our model is a little different in that we're operating as an extension of, in this case, King County Metro or cities and transit agencies in general. And so we work closely, but really follow their lead. We're operating either, as we are in Seattle, on a contract basis, but this is not our service. It's part of mass transit. And so we look to follow whatever both safety guidelines that they've enacted, as well as any service transition that they'd like. And we've worked with, again, dozens of partners to transition the service and continuing conversations with Seattle and others about how we can help sort of optimize their network. But these are all decisions like public transit that the city or the transit agency is making themselves. We're there to support them and try to enable the best transit through COVID and others, but these are their decisions.
Got it. And someone else asked whether CARES Act funding can be spent on the technology that transit agencies need to facilitate microtransit. We talked about kind of the benefits of that new on-demand technology platform and how it can help transit agencies innovate in their service provision. Will they actually be able to use some of these resources that have come in to shore up their revenue for those types of services and technology platforms?
Yeah, we've got several services that are using CARES Act funding to fund this, both as a setup fee, but also for ongoing operations. And again, that's a decision working through the local transit agency and cities on how they want to allocate those funds. But yeah, we've seen that in a couple cases.
Very interesting. Let's see. So this one is for Chris Pangilinan. The questioner, I said, you mentioned a partnership between Indigo and Microtransit. Can you tell us a little bit more about that partnership and what they're doing?
Sure. Yeah, I saw that question in there. So we are working with the Indigo, which is the transit agency in Indianapolis, Indiana, and providing, and what the agency is doing is they're providing subsidized rides on Uber to workers in Marion County to get around during this time. So helping provide essential worker service to complement their existing fixed route service today.
Got it. We have a question from Mary who poses a great provocation to the panel. She says, we've talked a lot about how we need to focus on attracting back the discretionary riders who may be fleeing the system during this time. But she's asking whether instead it would make sense for us to focus on improving the system for the people who are still using it, who are really dependent on the system. Maybe Chris Van Eyken, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's key. These people are going to likely remain the ridership base as we come out of the crisis. But I would also say the things that make transit good for those folks are the same ones that make them good for so-called choice riders. I don't really like using that term, but if we're providing reliable service, it's going to attract people from across the economic spectrum. But there does need to be an increased focus on ensuring that communities that are vulnerable have sufficient service and that they're being served well, because that's been a real shortcoming for transit agencies in the past. And I think SFMTA provides a great example for that. We've seen that they've kept their equity corridors in their new service plan. King County Metro is really good at this as well. They sort of make decisions on service planning with an equity lens, so they're not cutting communities off that really depend upon them, even if they have low transit ridership.
And Emily, if I may add to that, Chris, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, in public transportation, I think we shouldn't get too focused on trying to increase. Ridership increases are important, of course, but we want to also improve. If there's nothing wrong with improving service for existing riders too, even if it does cost extra money. And I think we should also be mindful of that. And I really like the way that the SFMTA did their equity analysis even before this COVID crisis, and that is something that people can lean on. So by doing these kind of analyses beforehand, or now if we have to, we can have something to fall back on when we need to make these difficult decisions on service additions or subtractions.
We have a question asking about changes to city streets. We've talked about some of the changes in street design that are affecting walking